I enjoy dirtling, like, so much. I love the kind of turns where I play a bunch of things that don't inherently impact the board or the game. Or at least that's what my opponents think. The fact that they let one random creature or enchantment stay on the battlefield long enough that an insignificant action like playing a land causes a chain reaction, ending with milling my opponents out or burning them out is the reason why I built my Omnath lands deck. It's been one of my favorite decks that I've built, and I thought I'd share it with all the kings out there. There are thousands of land decks, thousands of Omnath decks, but this is mine, and this is one I take great pride in playing. Now enough of the pleasantries, let's get to the deck. The commander of this deck is Omnath, Locus of Creation. Omnath is a legendary elemental 4/4 for red, green, white, and blue. When Omnath enters the battlefield, draw a card. Omnath has a Landfall ability that triggers 3 times. The first trigger gets you 4 life, the second trigger gets you 4 mana, and the last trigger deals 4 damage to each opponent and each planeswalker they control. This is a lands deck, so the main objective of this deck is to abuse the Landfall mechanic. Landfall was first keyworded back in original Zendikar, and is an ability that triggers whenever a land enters the battlefield on your side. This deck runs all kinds of Landfall abilities that gain life, goads creatures, draws cards, and everything in between. But before we talk about all the interactions in the deck, let's look at what I think is the most important aspect of this deck, the lands. One distinction I feel is important to make is that at its heart, this is a lands deck, not a landfall deck. While ramping is a thing this deck will inevitably do, that isn't its main objective. If you want more explanation of a lands deck versus a landfall deck, Surge of Loading Ready Run often plays a lands deck on their Canadian Highlander videos. That deck more or less inspired this deck. Now, at the time of recording, this deck runs 44 lands. That is quite a lot, but due to all the ways I can play additional lands in a turn, it surprisingly runs out quickly. I run a full suite of playable scry lands and life lands, dual lands that fixes my mana and provides some padding and fixes my draws. I also run all playable shocks and tri lands. The shock lands are tap lands at worst or duels that get me the color I need right away, while the tri lands are nearly perfect tapped fixing or replaces themselves for a card for a bit of an investment. This goes same for the cycle lands that enter tapped or draws a card for 1 mana. Now, the most important lands I run are the Ravnica bounce lands. These are tapped lands that add 2 mana but forces you to bounce a land on the battlefield back to your hand. These are the most important because this is what will get you to play the most amount of lands in a single turn. When you get more of your synergy pieces in play, you can play a bounce land, get all of the landfall triggers, then return the bounce land back to your hand. Combined with other effects that allow you to play multiple lands means that one land gets you the most value. Lands that tap for mana can't win the game alone, so we have a couple of utility lands that we run. Valakut bolts a target with enough mountains out. Field of the Dead creates a zombie army, and Castle Vantris scries away the bad cards. Now, to take care of opponents' utility lands, we run Wasteland, Strip Mine, and Ghost Quarter. Now, the land package deals with strict mana requirements of the deck, but allows us to abuse our synergy cards as many times as possible in a single turn. Half of what makes this deck run is the lands. Now, the other half is playing many lands. The deck runs many cards that have the play additional lands text, and sometimes followed up by special bonuses. We have Azusa, Oracle of Moldiah, and Exploration. These all allow us to play many lands on our turn. We also run cards like Growth Spiral, Llanowar Scout, and Walking Atlas that allows us to put lands down on an opponent's turn, which can get us the win with the proper setup. One key card is Elvish Reclaimer. This is a permanent crop rotation that sticks on the battlefield that sets us up with the proper lands. Now, the key to this deck is managing your land drops. When timed right, your payoffs will be great and plentiful. Speaking of payoffs, the deck currently runs 19 landfall cards. They vary between milling and dealing damage, making tokens, drawing cards, exiling creatures, and many other effects. The more I think about it, this is basically Enchantress. Having a single Enchantress effect is nice, but the more pieces you have out, the more powerful your plays become. Not only can playing multiple lands trigger Landfall multiple times in a turn, specific cards double them as well. Both Mommy Elish Norn and Ancient Green Warden causes our lands to trigger Landfall an additional time. Now to supercharge the deck, Ashaya Soul of the Wild makes our non-token creatures forest lands in addition to their other types. Imagine casting lands that trigger their own landfall, plus the other landfall abilities that are already on the battlefield. There are so many landfall cards that sometimes it feels like you just play cards and play lands. While this is an accurate statement, there are specific lines and play patterns to keep an eye out to end the game with. This deck doesn't have a singular win condition, but a number of combination of cards that, when paired together, have the ability to end the game. Now I won't be talking about landfall creatures since you can just check out the Moxfield link below and throw it in your deck, and there's your engine. Instead, I want to highlight combos that ensure your victory. I do run the Splendid Armageddon combo where you Armageddon all lands, including your own, and then cast Splendid Reclamation. This returns all the destroyed lands from your graveyard to your battlefield, triggering landfall for each returned land. But be careful if you do this play if you have Ashaya out. Armageddon destroys all lands, so if your creatures are lands, you destroy them too. Now remember, Splendid Reclamation returns only land cards. Ashaya's ability doesn't apply to creatures in your graveyard. Now if you're desperate for life, you can instead sacrifice all of your lands to your Zuran Orb, gaining 2 life per land and returning them afterwards with Splendid Reclamation. Combine Retreat to Coral Helm, a bounce land, and a creature that taps to put a land onto the battlefield to infinitely trigger landfall. Tap your Scout or your Atlas to put a bounce land onto the battlefield. Both Coral Helm and the bounce trigger are put onto the stack. With Retreat to Coral Helm, choose to untap your Scout or your Atlas, and with the bounce land, return itself back to your hand. Repeat this process to trigger landfall for all of your permanents and win the game. Deadeye Drake is another infinite mana combo in this deck. You do this by soul bonding Peregrine Drake to Deadeye Navigator. Now every instance of flickering Peregrine Drake nets you tons of mana, especially with cards like your bounce lands or the Mirari's Wake. After getting all of your mana, begin to flicker the Deadeye Navigator and pair it with Omnath. You do this because Omnath's landfall triggers only happen 3 times, and the 4th land drop doesn't do a thing. Every time Omnath is flickered, it resets Omnath, and you can trigger its landfall ability an additional 3 times, being able to rebuy the landfall value from Omnath. There is also the Scapeshift combo. If you played Modern or Standard back in the day, you sacrifice a large number of lands and get that many cards, plus your Valakut or your Field of the Dead, to attempt to burn everything out or prepare a huge army for your next turn. Try to Scapeshift after you have your Dryad of Elysian Grove out. Since Dryad makes everything all basic types, you need a minimum of 5 lands, one of which needs to be Valakut, to start bolting everything. Every land will trigger Valakut, and the more lands you grab out, the more you burn. And if you have the luxury, combine it with Elish Norn or Ancient Green Warden to double or even triple all of your triggers. Patron of the Moon and Lotus Cobra is another infinite loop that is in here. Pay the 1 to activate the Patron's ability to put 2 bounce lands into play. 2 bounce triggers and 2 Cobra triggers are now on the stack. Add 2 mana of whatever colors you need, and return the bounce lands back into your hand. Use 1 of the mana from the Lotus Cobra to activate Patron, and repeat the loop. Every instance nets you a mana, plus whatever landfall triggers are already on the battlefield. It is important to be aware of your land drops per turn. It is a never-changing figure that depends on what permanents are on the battlefield. At all times, the game is checking 2 things: the number of land drops you have made, and the number of land drops you are allowed to make. Remember that the number of lands you can make will always be a changing number depending on if cards like Azusa, Dryad, or AC are out on the battlefield. Since a majority of the lands haven't entered the battlefield trigger, it's a little hard to do this, but try to sequence your land drops as much as possible. Amulet Time players know what I'm talking about. Now let's say you start the turn with a couple of lands in your hand and an Azusa on the battlefield. This turn, you can make 3 land drops and you've played 0 so far. You play a land with an Enter the Battlefield ability, and that ability goes on the stack. You just gave your opponent an opportunity to destroy the Azusa. This is important because after Azusa is put into the graveyard and your land's ETB ability resolved, the game checks and sees that you can make 1 land drop, and you did play 1 land. Now, even though you did have Azusa on the battlefield, her ability isn't in effect since she's in the graveyard now. With this being a lands deck, you want to play as many lands per turn, so properly sequencing your land drops is key in the mid and late game. This deck is heavy on interaction, has a ton of agency, and is incredibly fun to play. I have so much fun playing this deck, and I think it's a great deck to have in a Commander player's arsenal, since there are so many flavors to build lands that it's an exercise to not only build but to play. You can go with a simpler lands deck and just slam lands to make your Avenger of Zendikar make 1,000,000 tokens, or you can build it more intricately to better utilize other colors and their landfall abilities. And if you like this deck tech, please connect with the channel to see other MTG videos and shorts. You can also connect with me on Instagram, where I post some Magic the Gathering memes and shorts and other opinions there too. Thank you so much, Kings, and I'll see you guys on the next video.